Hi, everyone. Welcome to our short video on what Scope 3 emissions are and why they matter. Thanks for tuning in today. So why do Scope 3 emissions matter? Well, although not all companies understand and report on their Scope 3 emissions, Scope 3 emissions are actually a huge portion of pretty much every company's overall carbon footprint. As you can see here, up to 95% of a company's emissions can be attributed to Scope 3. And you might be asking yourself, what even are Scope 3 emissions anyways, and why do they make up such a large portion of a company's footprint? Essentially, Scope 3 emissions come from your supply chain. Specifically in the healthcare industry, it's estimated that about 71% of healthcare industry emissions come from Scope 3, and your supply chain is connected to many others in your industry. In the healthcare industry, many suppliers are regulated, which means that you can't necessarily change the suppliers that you work with without going to a regulator for approval. And that means that changing suppliers and shifting your supply chain can be more challenging. And you need to work with your suppliers on measuring your Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and reducing those emissions, because switching suppliers or switching sourcing strategies cannot be easily done, as it can be in some other industries. Let's zoom in on that a little bit more closely. You have likely at this point learned about accounting and tracking Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but for many companies, that's really only that first step because of the large scale of emissions that Scope 3 makes up. And about only 42% of companies report their Scope 3 emissions currently. This number is likely to grow as emerging climate regulations are requiring companies to disclose not only Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but now some are starting to require Scope 3 as well. Across the healthcare industry, as you can see here, about 73% of companies report on Scope 3 emissions, which is much higher than average and shows that this industry is really leading in the climate landscape. Another reason that so many healthcare companies are required to disclose their Scope 3 emissions is because your supply chains are so closely intertwined, and because of that fact that switching suppliers cannot be easily done. That's a great reason why you're here today, to learn about your own Scope 3 emissions and how that ties back to both your suppliers and your customers' emissions, and how you can all work together to understand the industry's emissions and take action to reduce it. So let's dive just a little bit deeper into what Scope 3 emissions actually are. Scope 3 emissions cover a broad range of sources. They cover everything from a company's supply chain, including raw material sourcing, packaging, shipping and logistics, waste disposal, or even how your employees get to work. Because Scope 3 emissions cover such a wide depth and breadth of activities and sources, it can be challenging to calculate those related emissions. And you may really have a hard time even imagining how that could be done, because many of your Scope 3 activities occur outside of your own company and what you have direct control over. But that's kind of the entire point of Scope 3. We'll get into the details about Scope 3 categories later on, but when you really think about Scope 3, it's anything that happens upstream or downstream in your supply chain before the products that you build get to you or leave your facilities. For healthcare industries, there are examples of, hospitals or food clinics and trials, as well as patient transportation, that are all things that could be considered and might be happening in your supply chain and have existing greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. So the goal of Scope 3 is to really try to quantify the emissions associated with the activities that happen outside the doors of your facilities. Although it might seem challenging to quantify all of these Scope 3 emissions, there's a number of business benefits you can deploy and that you'll find when you begin to measure your Scope 3 emissions. The first thing about scoping 3 or tracking Scope 3 emissions is that it can help you reduce business risks. For example, your footprint can help identify emission hotspots in your supply chain or inefficiencies within your supply chain that can help with targeted emission reduction activities. Additionally, it can help identify bottlenecks, critical points, or resource risks within your supply chain that could impact your ability to, deliver the products that you produce and the services that you provide. Because Scope 3 is such a large portion of likely your footprint, it can help you understand your emissions so you can take proactive measures to reduce those emissions and avoid the costs of carbon offsets or taxes that may come in the future. Because you're in the healthcare industry with those unique structures of supply chain, it's important to think about how that plays a factor. And if you do identify those emission hotspots with certain suppliers or certain portions of your supply chain, you can think about what would be required to reduce those risks and what regulatory requirements may be associated with them. You can also think of things like if your equipment is energy efficient or if your routes are optimized to get your products to your facilities, and really identify ways to streamline and increase the efficiency of your business. Tracking Scope 3 emissions can also help you identify growth opportunities within your organization. Taking a low carbon viewpoint on your company's supply chain can help determine whether there's a market for new products or services. You may realize that you have certain businesses or customers who are interested in products with a lower carbon footprint, and this could expand opportunities for innovation and business expansion into areas that may be focused on sustainability. It can also help engage your supply chain in active greenhouse gas management and sustainable practices, because once you have a good understanding of those emissions, you can begin to think about how you can reduce them. At the end of the day, from our perspective, a sustainable business is a good business, and the industry is moving towards this, and so you'll find great opportunities for growth in that area. In regards to healthcare specifics around identifying opportunities, you can collaborate with your internal experts in different categories and category managers to identify emission reduction strategies. And you can also innovate around product design to reduce volume, weight, or spend. For example, you can think about green chemistry. That's an introduction on what are Scope 3 emissions and why they matter. Thanks for tuning in.